Imagine living in a golden castle where the only sound is the echo of your own footsteps. This was the life of Richard Sterling, the country's wealthiest real estate tycoon. His mansion was a fortress of luxury, yet inside those velvet walls lived a profound silence. His daughter, Alice, 7 years old, had not spoken a single word in 3 years. Since her mother's tragic death, her voice had simply vanished. Richard refused to accept his daughter's silence. He was a man who fixed problems with checkbooks. If a building had a crack, he poured concrete. If a business failed, he poured cash. He treated Alice's condition like a broken contract. He flew in neurologists from London, psychiatrists from New York, and healers from Asia. They poked and prodded the poor girl, prescribing sedatives that made her drowsy, but her voice remained locked tight. The doctors offered complex studies. They spoke of selective mutism, severe PTSD, and emotional blockage. Richard listened with growing impatience. He slammed his fists on mahogany desks, demanding immediate results. He didn't realize that his anger only made Alice shrink further away. She spent her days sitting by the massive window of her room, staring at the golden gates. She wasn't looking at the expensive toys. She was waiting for someone who never came. Meanwhile, just outside those high walls, reality was very different. The neighborhood was pristine and sterile, but every day at 10 a.m. a metallic rattling shattered the peace. It was the sound of a rusted shopping cart with a broken wheel bumping against the asphalt. Pushing it was Martha, an elderly woman in mismatched clothes. She was the can lady, a figure invisible to the elite, collecting what the rich threw away. Martha was despised by the locals. Ladies in expensive yoga pants crossed the street to avoid her. Private security guards watched her like a hawk, ready to chase her off if she touched a luxury car. But Martha never begged. She walked with dignity, humming a low, ancient melody. She picked up empty wine bottles and soda cans, ignoring the looks of disgust from neighbors who smelled of French perfume. However, there was a secret connection nobody knew about. Every time Martha's noisy cart passed Richard Sterling's mansion, she stopped. It wasn't for long, just a few seconds. She would look up at the second-floor window where little Alice sat. Martha would adjust her worn scarf and wipe a tear. She knew exactly who was in that window. And up there, Alice knew who was on the sidewalk. It was a silent conversation. One afternoon, a violent summer storm battered the city. Rain fell in sheets, washing the streets and sending everyone running for cover. Richard was home that day, pacing the living room, furious because a merger had been delayed. He was shouting into his phone when he noticed a draft. The front door was ajar. The wind had blown the electronic lock open. He rushed to close it, then froze. Alice was gone. The girl, who rarely left her bed, was out in the garden. She was wearing only her thin silk pajamas and was barefoot on the wet grass. The rain soaked her curls, but she didn't seem to care. Alice was walking toward the main gate, as if in a trance. Richard dropped his phone and sprinted outside, screaming her name. Terror gripped him. He was terrified of losing the only control he had left. When Richard reached the gate, he saw the reason for Alice's escape. On the other side of the iron bars, sheltering precariously under the security booth's overhang, was Martha. The wind had knocked her cart over, spilling cans all over the pristine driveway. The old woman was shivering, trying to gather her things. Alice stood gripping the cold metal bars, staring intently at the dirty, soaked woman. There was no fear, only recognition. Richard's reaction was immediate and brutal. His prejudice spoke louder than his curiosity. "Get back inside." "Alice," he roared, grabbing her arm roughly. He turned his fury on the old woman. "And you, get away from my property. You're filthy. I'll call the police if you don't vanish in 1 minute." He saw Martha only as a hygiene threat, a stain on his perfect painting. He couldn't see the humanity in her eyes. But something unprecedented happened. Alice, usually passive and silent, resisted. She yanked her arm back, breaking free from her father's grip. Richard was shocked. Alice had never disobeyed him. She turned to him, shook her head firmly, and then turned back to the fence, reaching her small hand through the bars. Martha, ignoring the millionaire's insults, stood up slowly. She didn't look at Richard. Her eyes were locked on the granddaughter she hadn't held in years. "Don't touch her. You have diseases." Richard screamed, lunging to pull Alice away again. But Martha was faster. From the pocket of her tattered coat, she pulled a small object wrapped in plastic. It was a rag doll, old, patched, with a dress made of colorful scraps. It was nothing compared to the porcelain dolls in Alice's room. But when the girl saw it, her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the wet grass. Reaching out, Richard stopped. The scene was too absurd to comprehend. Why was his daughter, who had everything, crying over a piece of trash in a beggar's hand? "What is that?" he asked, his voice shaking. Martha finally looked at him. Her face was wet with rain and tears. "This isn't trash, Richard," she said, her voice raspy but strong. "This is memory. It's the only thing left of my daughter that you didn't burn." The realization hit Richard like a physical blow. Helena, his late wife, Alice's mother. She was a sweet woman from a humble background whom he had loved deeply, but whose origins he tried to hide from high society. When Helena died, Richard, in his selfish grief and attempt to protect Alice from pain, ordered everything from her past destroyed. Old photos, cheap clothes, personal items. He erased her history to write a better one. "You... Richard stammered, finally recognizing the features beneath the grime. Years of hardship on the streets had aged Martha, but the eyes were Helena's. "You should be in the countryside. I sent you money to stay away." Martha smiled sadly. "The money ran out. Richard, my husband's medication took it all. But I didn't come for cash. I came because a grandmother's heart knows when her grandchild is dying of sadness." While they argued, Alice managed to grab the doll through the bars. She hugged the soaked toy against her chest and closed her eyes. The smell, that scent of lavender and old dust. It was her mother's scent. Helena had sewn that doll while pregnant, the same doll Richard called ugly and hid in the attic. Martha had rescued it from the trash years ago. Alice began rocking back and forth, a low sound escaping her throat. Richard looked at his daughter, frightened. "Alice," he called, forgetting his anger. She didn't respond. She was immersed in a world where only she and the doll existed. Martha stepped closer to the bars, ignoring the torrential rain. She began to hum. It was the same melody she hummed while pushing her cart. An old folk lullaby, something that didn't exist on Spotify or in the classical playlists Richard forced Alice to hear. "Lavender blue, dilly, dilly, ... Martha sang with a trembling voice. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. He remembered that song. Helena used to sing it to Alice when she was a baby. It was the only thing that stopped her crying during colic nights. How many times had he asked Helena to stop singing it because it was peasant music? His past arrogance was now haunting him. He had silenced his family's soul. Alice lifted her head. Her eyes met her grandmother's. The connection was electric. There were no walls, no money, no class difference between them, just blood and love. Alice opened her mouth. Her lips quivered. She tried to form the words, but her vocal cords were rusty from disuse. Martha kept singing, encouraging her, smiling through the rain. "Sing with me, my flower. Grandma is here." Grandma never really left. Richard wanted to interfere, to say this was that the old woman was confusing the girl, but his legs wouldn't move. He was witnessing a miracle that none of his millions could buy. The can lady, the woman he despised and banned, was doing what the world's top specialists failed to do. She was reaching Alice. She was healing the wound that Richard had helped to open with his coldness. Then it happened. Amidst the thunder and rain, a tiny, raspy voice cut through the air. "Lavender green, ... Quotes Alice completed the line. The phrase was quiet, broken, but clear. Richard covered his mouth with his hands. He fell to his knees in the mud, ruining his $3,000 Italian suit, but he didn't care. His daughter had spoken. After 3 years of absolute silence, her first words were not a request for a toy, but a song. "Keep going, my love," Martha urged, weeping openly now. Alice stood up, gripping her grandmother's hand through the bars as if it were her lifeline. "When I am king, dilly, dilly, ... double quotes," the girl said. Louder this time. She smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her pale face. Richard watched like a spectator in his own life. He realized how small he was. All his power and influence meant nothing compared to this moment. Alice looked at her father, still kneeling in the mud. Her gaze wasn't angry. It was pitying. She understood, with the wisdom only suffering children possess, that her father was as sick as she was. Sick with pride, sick with loneliness. "Daddy," she said. Richard raised his head. "Hopeful? Open the gate." Grandma is cold. That simple command carried an authority Richard never dared to challenge. It was the voice of truth. Trembling, Richard stood up. He walked to the control panel on the wall. His hands shook so badly he entered the wrong code twice. Finally, the mechanism buzzed, and the great golden gate began to slide open. It wasn't just metal moving. It was the breaking of a barrier he had built for years. Martha stood there, small, fragile, holding her cart like a shield. She looked at her son-in-law with fear, expecting to be but Richard didn't yell. He looked at the woman who gave birth to the love of his life. He saw the wrinkles, the dirty clothes, the poverty, and he saw himself reflected in the shame of those eyes. He walked up to her. The rain poured over them. Martha ... double quotes, he began, his voice cracking. Forgive me. It wasn't a formal business apology. It was a plea for mercy from a broken man. He took her calloused hand and kissed it. Martha, who expected insults, she touched Richard's face with her other hand. Pain makes us blind, my son. You were blind with grief for Helena, and you thought erasing us would erase the pain. But pain only heals with love, not forgetfulness. Alice ran and hugged her grandmother's legs, dirtying her silk pajamas with street mud. Richard joined the hug. There, in the rain, the three wept together, washing away years of lies. Richard grabbed Martha's shopping cart. Leave this, he said. You will never have to push this again. He guided his mother-in-law and daughter inside the mansion. The security team watched in shock on the monitors. Their boss, covered in mud, pushing a cart of trash and hugging a beggar. But Richard didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt clean inside. The house, once cold and silent, seemed to warm up the moment Martha stepped onto the marble floor. That night, the mansion's routine was turned upside down. Richard dismissed the staff and personally drew a warm bath for Martha in the guest suite, the best room in the house. He fetched Helena's clothes, which she secretly never had the courage to throw away, from a locked trunk. When Martha emerged from the bath, wearing a soft robe and smelling of jasmine soap, Alice clapped. You look like a queen, Grandma, she said, her voice still raspy but flowing like a river on blood. They ate in the kitchen, not the formal dining room. Martha insisted on making soup. Rich people food doesn't fill the soul, she said, taking over the industrial stove. The smell of soldered onions and simple spices invaded the house. Richard sat at the table, watching his daughter help peel potatoes. Alice talked non-stop. She spoke about the birds she saw, the dreams she had, asking about Grandpa. 3 years of stored words came pouring out at once. During dinner, Martha told her story. After Richard kicked her out and cut contact, she lived in a rented room. When her husband got sick, the money vanished. She was evicted. Out of pride and fear of tarnishing her daughter's memory, she never went to the press or caused a scandal. She became a collector, but I never stopped watching you, she said, sipping her soup. I saw the doctors come and go. I prayed every day for God to break that stone in your chest, Richard. Richard listened in silence, shame burning his face. He realized that in trying to be a somebody in society, he had become a nobody in his own home. He had sacrificed his daughter's happiness on the altar of his ego. I will fix this, he promised. Martha, this house is yours. You will never be cold or hungry again. I was a monster, but I want to try to be the father Alice deserves. Alice's recovery was rapid and surprising. The doctors were fired. The speech therapist stayed, but now she mostly just laughed during sessions because Alice talked a mile a minute. Martha's presence brought life to the mansion. She planted a vegetable garden in the ornamental yard. She taught Alice to sew dolls. The house, once a silent mausoleum, was now full of music, the smell of corn cake, and laughter. The rich neighbors turned up their noses at the peasant woman, but Richard ignored them with pleasure. One day, Richard found the shopping cart in the garage where he had left it that rainy night. He thought about throwing it away, but he had a better idea. He had it cleaned, varnished, and placed in a glass case in the lobby of his corporate headquarters, right next to abstract art worth millions. Below it, a gold plaque read, "The most valuable vehicle I ever owned." It brought back my daughter's voice. His employees didn't understand, clients thought it was eccentric, but Richard made a point of telling the story to anyone who asked. He was no longer ashamed of his family's humble origins. On the contrary, He used his influence to create support projects for recyclers in the city. He turned his guilt into action. The Helena Foundation was born to give dignity to invisible people like Martha had been. Alice grew up surrounded by real love. She didn't become a vain heiress worried about designer bags. She went with her grandmother to visit shelters, played in the dirt, and knew the value of a hug. Achikinzi Alice gave a speech at her school. The auditorium was packed with wealthy, influential parents. Richard and Martha were in the front row. Alice took the microphone and, with a steady, clear voice, said, "My father gave me everything money could buy, but it was my grandmother, with a wooden whistle and a cart of trash, who gave me my voice." The audience fell silent, shocked by her honesty. Alice continued, "Many of you here have giant houses and children who don't talk to you. Maybe not because they are mute, like I was, but because you are deaf, deafened by the noise of money, meetings, and appearances. My grandmother taught me that silence is only broken when someone is willing to listen with their heart, not their ears." Reacher wept openly. Martha held his hand, squeezing it affectionately. At the end of the speech, Alice walked off the stage and handed her grandmother a bouquet of lavender. The can lady, now an elegant woman with well-kept white hair, received a standing ovation, not for her son-in-law's money, but for the power of her own story. She proved that dignity isn't in the tag on your clothes, but in the purity of your character. The Sterling family story spread. It became a magazine feature, a documentary, but for them, what mattered were Sundays. Every Sunday, rain or shine, they sat on the porch. Richard played guitar, which he learned with difficulty. Alice sang, and Martha knitted. They sang Lavender Blue. Passers-by heard the music and smiled. The mansion was no longer the lonely ogre's castle. It was the house where love lived. Martha lived for 20 more years. She passed away in her sleep, peaceful, in the soft bed her son-in-law gave her, holding her adult granddaughter's hand. At the funeral, it wasn't just the city's elite. There were hundreds of collectors, homeless people, and simple folks the foundation had helped. Richard insisted on carrying the coffin. He mourned his mother-in-law as if she were his own mother. On her tombstone, he wrote, "Here lies the richest woman in the world, for she possessed the gold that cannot be sold." True love. Alice became a doctor, specializing in childhood trauma. She uses unconventional methods. In her ultramodern office, there aren't just state-of-the-art machines. There's a box full of rag dolls, wooden whistles, and simple toys. When a silent child arrives, locked up by fear or pain, Alice doesn't prescribe sedatives. She sits on the floor, picks up a patch doll, and begins to hum an old lullaby. And it works. It almost always works. Because Alice knows that healing often doesn't come from science. It comes from connection. She knows that inside every silent child is a cry for help, waiting for someone who isn't afraid to get dirty in the mud to rescue them. She learned that at her front gate on a rainy day from a lady who smelled of trash and lavender. Today, Richard is retired. He spends his afternoons tending the garden Martha planted. Sometimes he goes to the gate and looks out at the street. Not with fear, but with gratitude. He waits to see if anyone needs help. The Golden Gate, which once served to keep people out, now stays open, because Richard learned the most valuable lesson of all: the best visitors don't ring the doorbell. They touch the soul. If this story touched your heart, if you remembered your grandmother, your mother, or someone who loved you without asking for anything in return, leave a like. Comment down below, love heals, and share this video with that arrogant person who needs to learn that money isn't everything. The world needs more Marthas and fewer walls. Subscribe to the channel for more victory stories. See you next time.